Welcome back to the deep dive. We are really getting into the weeds today, moving past the usual topics and, looking right at the fundamental structures of reality.
That's right. We're tackling some massive questions here. Questions philosophers, theologians, well, people have wrestled with forever.
Exactly. And today, it's all about the relationship between the creator and the created, specifically this core issue of inherent capacity versus moral responsibility.
It's a deep dive into what you might call existential architecture. The sources we're looking at today, they really hammer on the central tension. What can a created being actually do? Can a creature, just using its own strength, its own internal power, actually fulfill what seems to be the highest command? Perfect love for God and for others.
That totally reframes how you think about obedience, doesn't it? It's not just do this, it's is it even possible how it's commanded? So our mission today is to really unpack the two main views these sources present on that capacity. And in doing that, we'll explore what the sources claim is, well, absolutely crucial. Divine grace, the risk involved in free will, and maybe surprisingly, the foundational role of the cross in how the universe is actually set up.
And this isn't just abstract theory. For you listening, the answer here defines the very conditions for what the sources call eternal life.
Right. They explicitly link keeping commandments to gaining life. That's a major point they draw out.
So if we don't grasp how we're supposed to keep these commandments, then we're fundamentally missing the rule book for existence according to these texts.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's define this central conflict properly. Right, so as soon as we ask, can created beings love perfectly? Well, we hit this sort of fork in the road. Two opposing views on capacity.
The basic question is pretty clear, right? Can creatures obey the command to love just by themselves, using only their own inherent strength, totally independent of any outside help?
And the first view, which honestly feels kind of intuitive, says, yeah, absolutely they must be able to.
Makes sense on the surface.
The logic is strong. A good God wouldn't command something impossible. If the command's there, the ability must be too. Some texts suggest God's commands aren't heavy burdens. They're doable.
It's a common perspective.
Yeah.
But our sources, they pivot hard away from that. They argue that view misses the whole point of being created, being, dependent. Okay, so view number two, which is really the foundation for everything we're discussing today, is quite definitive. No, created beings cannot obey the commandment of love except through God's grace. This isn't like a temporary fix. It's a constant enabling power. Dependency is fundamental.
Okay, hang on. Let's slow down there because that's the core thesis, right? Dependency.
Oh, yeah.
But if a creature has enough capacity to understand the command, why isn't that understanding enough to just do it? Why is external grace still needed?
Because according to these sources, perfect moral action specifically, perfect continuous love is structurally the same as being self-sustaining. This is where we need to unpack the logic of self-sufficiency. It's a really crucial step in their argument.
Why is loving God by your own power the same as living eternally by your own power? That feels like a big leap. How do they justify that?
It's about cause and effect, really,
Yeah.
and perpetuity. Think about it. If a creature could start and sustain perfect love for God and others purely from its own resources, then that creature would basically possess the power to create and maintain the condition for eternal life all by itself. Remember, the sources say the created order is set up so that loving God results in eternal life.
So the act of perfect love is the cause and eternal life is the effect. If I can control the cause entirely on my own.
You effectively control the effect. Exactly. The argument is, if a creature is self-sufficient in achieving the cause, this perfect autonomous love without sinning, it basically eliminates the need for God's ongoing input for the effect, which is eternal life.
Wow.
The creature would reach a state of moral perfection that, by the rules of this created world, guarantees its continued existence. This kind of independent, self-started love equals self-sustained life is presented as impossible under the current intentional design of reality. The creature has to remain dependent structurally.
So the command to love isn't just a moral rule. It's designed almost like a tether. It forces the creature back to the creator for the fuel needed to actually fulfill the command.
That's a great way to put it.
And if the creature could somehow bypass the need for that fuel, the grace it would achieve autonomy, which contradicts its very nature as something created, something dependent.
That's precisely the architectural argument presented. The dependency is deliberately built in to prevent the creature from, becoming its own God, essentially. achieving self-sovereignty.
Mm.
And this leads us straight to the non-negotiable prerequisite that establishes this dependency, knowing God's love first.
Right. This is beautifully put in that verse they often cite. We love because he first loved us. It sets up this fundamentally reactive posture for the created being.
The sequence is absolutely critical in these texts. Created beings can only even start to love God and neighbor after they have recognized, known, and sort of absorbed God's first foundational act of love towards them. That knowledge has to come before the creature's action.
What if God had done it differently, like created beings who were just born fully capable of obeying without needing to recognize his love first?
The sources are pretty blunt about that. If God had designed a system where creatures could keep the commandment without first knowing his love, it would imply they were created to get eternal life without him. It would mean creating beings whose moral ability was totally independent of the Creator's relationship with them. But God chose this system specifically to enforce that relational starting point, to make sure the foundation for staying alive forever is always recognition, then response, and ongoing dependence. The system is basically designed to prevent self-contained morality.
Okay, so dependency is the rule. The sources establish that. Now, let's look at the mechanics. How does this constantly dependent creature actually manage to obey? The answer seems to be grace, that essential enabling power.
Grace is the operational piece, yeah. The sources are very clear. Creatures keep the commandments only through God's grace. It's not just, a pardon when you mess up. It's the active energy, the provision needed for successful obedience.
And it's actively given.
Actively granted by the Creator, specifically to those who are trying, who are seeking to follow the law.
Can we look at that Abimelech example the source uses? Because it helps clarify what this active enabling grace looks like. Often we just think grace equals forgiveness.
Right. The Abimelech story is interesting. In Genesis, he was stopped from taking Sarah, who was Abraham's wife. Abimelech later says to God, basically, hey, I acted with integrity, and God replies, yes, I know you did, and I kept you from sinning against me.
So God physically restrained him.
That's the implication. God's grace acted like an external intervention, a governor on Abimelech's actions, preventing the transgression. So grace, in this instance, is shown as a kind of preventative power. It shores up the creature's moral resolve when it's being tested.
That makes grace sound less like an optional extra and more like, I don't know, the essential support beams holding up the whole moral structure of the universe for creatures.
That's a very good analogy. Without those beams, the creature's own moral structure just collapses.
Okay. But if grace is external and constant and necessary, there has to be some way for the creature to interact with it, right? Otherwise, they're just puppets.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of rejection, tied directly to free will, becomes absolutely critical.
So the creature can actually choose to push away those support beams.
Absolutely. Critically, the sources emphasize created beings have the power to actively reject the grace that's offered. They point to verses like the one in 2 Corinthians, urging people not to receive God's grace in vain.
Implying it requires active acceptance.
Right. It's not passive. You have to engage with it.
Yeah.
And a creature who definitively rejects that continuous flow of enabling power, they immediately lose the capacity to keep the commandments. The ability is gone because the power source is refused.
So the ability to obey is directly tied to accepting the gift. That distinction is really important, isn't it? Because it sets up the whole basis for divine justice and why the creature is still accountable for its failures.
It's the bedrock of accountability in this framework. The sources go to, honestly, incredible lengths to establish this principle of divine justice and provision. They insist God always extends grace. He wants to bestow it constantly. They use examples like Jeremiah, where God is shown persistently sending warnings, offering guidance. The provision is always available.
And then they make that really dramatic claim about what it would mean if God didn't provide it.
Yes, it's a stark statement. The sources declare it's structurally impossible for a creature to perish eternally because God unfairly withheld the necessary grace.
Why?
Because if God commanded dependence on grace, but then unjustly withheld that necessary grace, he would, according to the source, cease to be righteous. He would effectively become the source uses the strong term murderer, someone who commands life and then deliberately withdraws the required sustenance, causing death.
Wow, that's profound. It means God's own justice is tied to his absolute constant provision of the grace needed. It has to be there.
And to really drive home the accountability part, the source uses that powerful analogy, the mother and the baby.
Right, explain that.
If a mother refuses to feed her hungry baby, who's at fault? The mother, obviously. She withheld what was necessary for life. But if the mother is constantly offering milk, the means of life, and the baby refuses to drink it, turns its head away,
Then the responsibility shifts.
then the resulting harm, the potential starvation, rests entirely on the baby's choice to refuse the provision.
That analogy is a key because it puts the fault squarely on the creature's use of free will, their rejection not on any lack in the system or the provider.
Exactly. It reframes the issue away from capacity, which God supplies via grace, and onto willingness, which the creature controls. The responsibility for failing always comes down to rejecting sufficient provision, never because the provision itself was lacking.
And this principle gets immediately stress-tested with the ultimate example of rejection. The fall of Helo, or Satan Lucifer. This case is used to show that the mother-baby principle applies even at the highest levels of creation.
Helo is the ultimate test case, yeah? The source argues very strongly. Helo didn't fall because God suddenly cut off the grace or failed to provide it. Helo fell because he actively, definitively rejected God's grace. He chose self-rule over dependence.
So what happens once that rejection becomes like a final fixed state of the heart?
God respects that choice, however devastating. The source says God then leaves Helo to his debased heart, referencing a principle found in Romans. Once a creature makes that final, unshakable rejection of the necessary provision, God stops intervening against that choice. He allows the natural consequences of that internal decision, which are structural decay, spiritual death, to fully play out.
But this brings up that really tricky question about God's foreknowledge. If God knew Helo would fall, doesn't that kind of make him responsible? Didn't it predetermine the fall?
The sources is very careful here. They distinguish sharply between foreknowledge and causation. God knew Helo's choice beforehand, yes, but knowing isn't the same as causing.
Okay.
God then uses the consequences of Helo's fall within his larger plan, but he's explicitly not the author of Helo's initial decision to sin. They point to James. God tempts no one. To suggest God caused the sin would shatter the very foundation of divine justice the sources are trying so hard to build.
So God remains just.
God remains just. The responsibility for initiating sin belongs entirely to the creature who rejected the available grace. The intent to rebel, the intent to, as the source implies, ultimately harm the son that belonged to Helo. God permitted it and then worked his purposes through the aftermath of that wicked choice. Hashtag 3:3. The unique structure of creation and the purpose of the commandment.
Okay, so we've established creatures are dependent on grace and totally accountable if they reject it. But the big question looms. Why? Why did God set up the universe this specific way, this dependency-based, high-stakes system?
And the sources insist. This wasn't an accident. It's the intentional design of the created realm. God specifically designed the universe so that creatures must remain in relationship with him.
Okay.
And this ongoing relationship, this remaining in him, is structurally secured through the mechanism of the cross.
Whoa. That's a pretty radical claim about the architecture. The cross isn't just plan B for when sin happens. It's somehow part of the original blueprint, an intended feature.
That's exactly how the source material presents it. It argues, look, if God had just wanted creatures to achieve love and eternal life through simple, self-powered obedience, he would have chosen a totally different way to create.
Like what?
Maybe creating beings instantly perfect, unchangeably good. Who knows? But instead, he chose this structure, a structure where staying connected to him, secured by the incredibly costly sacrifice of the cross, is the absolute prerequisite for eternal existence. It prioritizes relationship, costly proof, over just, a simple decree.
And a big reason for this mandatory connection seems to be the current condition of created beings. You said the commandment is perfect, but the creature isn't.
Yes, the sources are emphatic on this. The commandment reflects God's perfect nature, sure, but the state of the creature as it currently exists is described as incomplete, not finished.
Incomplete.
And this incompleteness is tied directly to them being created, not divine, and crucially, possessing a freedom that hasn't been fully, confirmed or finalized yet.
What does this structural imperfection actually look like? Is it just the tendency to mess up or something deeper?
It seems deeper. The source points to two key things. A residual, maybe even foundational, doubt towards God, and because of that doubt, the ongoing possibility of sinning.
And that possibility exists because...
Because God gave them free will. The implication is that free will, in its initial raw state, inherently carries the risk of choosing rebellion. True freedom has to include the potential to question, even reject, the very source of your being. Creatures aren't initially given perfected freedom, just the capacity to choose.
Okay, so free will means doubt is possible, sin is possible, therefore the creature is incomplete, not yet fully stable in its obedience. Which brings us back to the commandment itself. If the creature is incomplete, why command perfect love? Seems like setting them up to fail.
Well, the commandment serves a couple of functions here, according to the sources.
Right.
First, they reaffirm. God only commands what creatures can sufficiently keep, but through the grace he provides. So it is feasible with help. Second, and this is fascinating, the current situation requires the full confirmation, the proof of the commandment's truthfulness.
Confirmation, proof. You mean proving it's a good law, or proving it can actually be done. And who needs this proof? Us. God.
This is one of the most surprising details in the material. The confirmation process is ongoing because, get this, doubts apparently remain even among the angels regarding the commandments.
Angels have doubts.
Doubts about the feasibility of the commands, and maybe even about the justice and goodness of the God who issued them. The source actually points to a verse in 1 Peter, suggesting angels long to understand these things more fully.
So the whole universe, heaven included, is like this giant cosmic courtroom, watching humanity's story unfold to see if God's law really works, if his way is truly just.
That's strongly implied, yes. The created realm becomes a kind of laboratory for testing moral truth. The experiment is meant to prove that dependence on God through his chosen method, the cross, leads to achievable love and life.
While self-sufficiency, Hillel's path, only leads to decay.
Exactly. The confirmation process is the universe collectively learning the ultimate rules of reality, both moral and structural.
And the key piece of evidence in this cosmic trial has to be someone who embodies both the divine standard and the created potential. Which brings us to Christ, who the sources connect directly to Adam as the ultimate model and proof.
Yes. God confirms the truth of the commandment through Christ becoming human, becoming the representative Adam. He lives that life of perfect dependence, perfect obedience through grace.
Showing it can be done.
Showing it can be done by a creature relying on God, yes. But his demonstration does two things. It proves the law is keepable with grace, and he himself becomes the very reason why creatures must keep the commandment.
The reason? How so?
Because his sacrifice validates the character of the lawgiver. They point to Romans 5. God proved his own love because Christ died for us while we were still sinners. Christ's suffering and obedience don't just prove the possibility of obedience, they simultaneously prove the incredible love and justice of the God who commands it. It aims to silence all those lingering doubts about whether the command to love is truly good and fair.
Okay, if the whole structure requires creatures to remain in God, and that connection is secured through the cross, we need to dig deeper into the cross's function. It's more than just wiping the slate clean after sin. You said it's needed to complete free will.
This is really the heart of the matter in these sources. They argue that raw initial free will, that basic capacity to choose for or against God, cannot be fully completed or perfected without the structural intervention of the cross. Free will is given at creation, but it's not finished.
So free will starts out as this unstable, dangerous potential until the cross stabilizes it. What does completed free will even mean, practically speaking?
Well, raw free will always holds the possibility of that final destructive no, like we saw with Hillel. Completed free will, as presented here, is the creature making a definitive, permanent choice for God, a choice for radical allegiance and dependence, a choice so deep it essentially removes the risk of future collapse or rejection.
And the cross provides the way to make that definitive choice.
It provides the necessary context, the mechanism, and the power for that final decisive turn back to God.
The sources use the prodigal son story here, right?
Yeah.
How does that illustrate this idea of completing free will?
Yeah, the prodigal son. When he hits rock bottom, destitute in the pigsty, the text says he came to himself. He has this moment of clarity.
Right.
He realizes his catastrophic error and makes the choice to return. But notice how he plans to return. Not demanding his rights as a son, but hoping to be accepted as a hired servant, completely dependent on his father's mercy.
Acknowledging total dependence.
That realization, and the action that follows, is framed as the ultimate use of his freedom. The freedom to choose definitive, self-emptying dependence over destructive self-will. The cross, in this view, embodies that turning point for all creation. It creates the space and provides the power for creatures to decisively renounce self-sovereignty and choose dependence.
So the cross isn't just a payment. It's a structural component that takes the creature's raw, unstable freedom and anchors it permanently in dependence on God.
That's the idea. Exactly. But achieving this structural necessity involved an almost unbelievable cost. The sources really emphasize this was a painful choice for the creator.
Yeah, the text highlights the agony, not just for the son, but for the father, too. This wasn't some painless cosmic transaction.
No, they go to great lengths to portray the agony. They mention Christ's prayer in Gethsemane, let this cup pass, showing the son's struggle. And they use that heart-wrenching analogy of Abraham preparing to sacrifice Isaac to hint at the father's suffering.
What was the core of that agony, structurally?
The structural agony, as presented, is this. For the creature's free will to be stabilized and completed, the father must abandon the son, and the son must endure that abandonment. He experiences the ultimate consequence of rejection, separation from God vicariously on behalf of created beings who chose that path. This suffering seems intentionally designed into the process, almost to demonstrate the true cost of moral failure and the depth of love required to fix it.
So God deliberately chose a universe where finalizing freedom for his creatures required the specific, intentional, agonizing self-sacrifice from himself, which leads us to what you called the sacrificial economy of life.
Right. The pathway to eternal life is directly wired into this agonizing choice. The sources state clearly, to get eternal life, creatures must receive God's grace and ultimately drink the blood of the cross on. You cite John 6. And it's framed as non-optional. Without internally receiving this, the source says there's no eternal life in the creature.
Let's pause on that phrase, drinking the blood. That sounds incredibly literal, especially if we're talking about the structure of a created being. Is it just a metaphor? Or does the source material imply something more physical?
The implication is definitely profound and seems to lean towards something more than just metaphor, something physical and existential. It suggests God physically became a creature for the specific purpose of pouring his divine life, his essence symbolized by blood, into the created order. They reference the communion words. This is my body, broken for you. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you.
Okay, so if the creature's original structure has this built-in risk of doubt and decay because of raw free will, does incorporating the son's blood act like a kind of structural reinforcement, a permanent infusion of divine, stable life?
That is precisely the implication.
Yeah.
Yes, the blood isn't just the price paid. It's presented as the necessary material for the created being's permanent structural integrity. It functions almost like a foundational repair and upgrade. It ensures that the creature, now infused with the very life of the Son, can maintain that state of perfect dependence and completed free will forever without the risk of backsliding into the instability of its original unconfirmed state.
So dependency becomes internalized, permanent.
Grounded in the actual life received directly from the Creator, mediated through the Son.
The son's sacrifice, therefore, literally re-engineers the creature to ensure its permanence within God's intended design. #HashTV, the profound mysteries of God's design, the unanswered why. Wow, okay, we've taken quite a journey here. Through the intentional design of existence, tracing this line from the limits of what creatures can do, all the way to the structural necessity of the cross. It reveals an incredibly complex, costly, and frankly indirect system.
It really forces you to step back and just look at the staggering design choices God apparently made. Choices that define the reality we experience.
Let's recap those key choices. Choice number 1. God chose to create beings with free will. Right away, that introduced the huge risk of rebellion and this whole need for cosmic proof or confirmation.
Choice 2. God chose a structure where creatures fundamentally cannot live without grace. Dependency is mandatory, eliminating self-sovereignty from the equation structurally.
Choice 3. God chose a path that required the pain of the cross, the Father's agony, the Son's abandonment as the mechanism to secure and complete that free will.
And choice 4, which still feels deeply mysterious, God chose to create creatures initially ignorant of the depth of his love. They have to learn it later, through revelation, experience, history, the cross itself. Why the delay? Why not start with full knowledge?
Yeah, the whole structure seems deliberately complex, deliberately costly, deliberately roundabout. And the source material, when it gets to the end, basically acknowledges that fully grasping why God chose this specific intricate path might be beyond us.
Exactly. The text kind of culminates in these big unanswered questions. Why this system that required God himself to suffer so immensely? Why was free will so essential if it carried such risk? Why this specific requirement of the blood for life? Why this sacrificial method?
So how does the speaker in the source ultimately deal with that tension between understanding the mechanics and understanding the why?
The final stance isn't intellectual mastery. It's a powerful declaration of submission and trust. The speaker basically says, look, I don't fully know why. I simply obey because God designed it and enacted it this way.
Wow.
It's that theological pivot point, recognizing the incredible complex structure while accepting the inherent mystery behind the Creator's ultimate motives. It really echoes that sentiment in Romans, right? Can the pot question the potter about why it was made a certain way? The structure is what it is. Our task is obedience within that given structure.
It's the final admission that we can map the, grace plus the potential for rejection plus the cross equals completed freedom, but the sovereign choice to implement that specific, costly how remains ultimately a mystery held by God.
Yeah. The sources show us a reality defined by intentional, profound, and incredibly expensive sacrifice. And they suggest our quest for knowledge has to eventually bow to the reality of that divine architecture, even if we don't grasp every single reason behind it.
Well, this has been an absolutely intense deep dive, really plumbing the depths of created limits and the staggering cost of divine provision.
We started with what seemed like a simple question, can creatures love God on their own? And ended up examining a detailed blueprint for the entire cosmos. The sources really compel you towards the conclusion that dependency relying on grace, relying on the cross, isn't some kind of flaw or weakness. It's the fundamental intentional design. It's the necessary path for created freedom to be completed and made secure.
And as we wrap up this exploration, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to wrestle with. If the whole point of this complex structure, this ongoing cosmic drama, is to fully confirm the truth and feasibility of the command to love, what does that mean for the created realm right now? If angels are still watching, if doubts are still being answered through this process, what does your own personal journey of choosing dependence, embracing grace through the cross, actually contribute to that larger cosmic confirmation? And what does it really mean for your life that free will isn't just a static thing you were born with, but a dynamic process that the cross is designed to complete? Something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for this certainly challenging but hopefully profound look at the architecture of divine grace.
We'll see you next time for the next deep dive.